I'm back to answer a Halloween-related question. Are artificial pumpkins as good as real pumpkins? Let's find out. So a variety of companies now are making these artificial pumpkins. These are carvable pumpkins that are made out of some sort of a foam material. And the idea is, instead of having the mess of a real pumpkin, you could carve one of these and supposedly they're just as good. Today I'm going to find out whether they are as good as the real ones, and we're going to discuss some of the advantages and disadvantages of artificial pumpkins versus real pumpkins. Let's talk about price first. These are artificial pumpkins from the Holiday Living Company, and this larger one cost $12.98. So these are significantly more expensive than real pumpkins. I got a real pumpkin about twice this size for about half the price, which means if you're going to go with the artificial pumpkin, you have to shell out some more cash up front. However, if you're planning on carving them once and using them year after year, long term, these could end up being cheaper because the real pumpkins are only good for maybe a week or so, whereas these, if you take good care of them and store them well, could be good essentially permanently. The big advantage of the artificial pumpkin, I would think, aside from its longevity, is there's no mess to clean up, or at least less mess to clean up. You don't have to hollow out guts and a nice, nasty, sticky mess like you do with a real pumpkin. These are hollow and they're made of foam, so there should be significantly less mess, although it's possible there could be dust when we carve them, so we're going to find that out as well. There are several other concerns. Are they as easy to carve? Are they easier? Are they harder? Do they look as good? Do they look realistic? How well does the light shine through? And particularly if you're using candles for your light, are these flammable, or will they melt, or will they hold up to a candle just like a real pumpkin would? We're going to test all of those things and try them out. In order to test these, I have 3 patterns. I'm going to follow the traditional poking method to see how well that works. I have a sort of a traditional jack-o'-lantern pattern from Stonykins, a Sam from Trick or Treat from Zombie Pumpkins, and a Bloody Mary also from Stonykins. So we're going to assign those to these various pumpkins. I'm going to carve them and we're going to see how it works. I'm going to start with the easiest one. I've put a pattern on the pumpkin. This is a traditional jack-o'-lantern pumpkin with triangle eyes. This is the sort of thing that you wouldn't even really need a pattern for, but in order to sort of be consistent with all of my tests, I am using a pattern. This one is from Stonykins, and I'm going to be using these pumpkin carving tools that I mentioned in a previous video about Halloween-related products available from Amazon. So we're going to try those out at the same time. One of the big questions is how well the holes will show up when you poke through the pattern. In other words, how well the pattern transfers. There are companies that make things that you trace over and it leaves a sort of chalk residue on the pumpkin. That will for sure work, but I'm interested in seeing whether the traditional punching through method will also work, so we're going to find out. As a matter of fact, I want to actually try on the back side before I try to go through the pattern, just to see how well the holes actually show up. Okay, let's give it a try right here. Okay, so I noticed that the hole does sort of reseal itself a little bit, but nevertheless it does transfer enough that you'll still be able to see what you're doing. If you're working with something particularly delicate, you may want to trace over that with a pin, as I'll probably do with some of my other carvings. But for this, the holes should be just fine. So I'm going to go ahead and get started. One of the important things is as you go around the ridges of the pumpkin, you want to make sure that you poke all the way through so you can still see your hole when you poke through. Alright, the pattern is transferred. Let's take the paper off and see how it looks. The tape actually sticks better to this than it does to real pumpkins, which could be mostly an advantage, although it makes it a little harder to peel the paper off. And there it is. It's clearly visible, although if it were a more delicate carving, I know that I would want to retrace that with a pin to make it a little bit more visible, but in this case, I should have no problem carving this. And before I actually start carving the face, I'm going to take the top off so that I have access to the inside so I can put a light inside. If you were doing a regular pumpkin, you would do this as the first step and make sure that you get all of the guts cleaned out first. In this case, it doesn't really matter whether you do it first or last. I'm going to do it now. So as I'm carving the top off here, I do notice there's some foam dust falling around, which is why I have newspaper in front of me. On a regular pumpkin, there would not be as much of a mess at this point, but there would be significantly more mess earlier. And this is what it looks like on the inside. Just fairly thin, about a centimeter thick foam. And it's hollow on the inside, and you can see a little bit of that dust from my carving lying around on the inside, so I'll dump that out. Well, so far I'm fairly happy. Let's try actually carving the face and see how it works. Some people like to take each piece out as they carve it. I like to leave them in until as much is finished as possible because it sort of lends some extra structural support if I'm doing something more delicate. It doesn't really matter in this case, I'm just sticking to my old habits. As I'm carving, I notice that it carves very easy, but the initial puncture with the saw to get through the, I guess you would call it the rind of the foam pumpkin, is a little bit tougher than it is on a real pumpkin. You'll also notice as I'm carving, I'm switching between these various sets of tools. I'm just trying to decide which one is my favorite. Okay, it should be carved. Let's get these pieces out. And just a little bit of cleanup around the edges to make it, well, cleaner. So there it is. That's what it looks like. Worked very well. I don't think I like it quite as well as a regular pumpkin, but given its advantages, I'm certainly happy with it. Now, lighting a pumpkin like this can be an interesting challenge. I'm not sure whether this foam material is flammable, whether it will melt, whether you could use a candle, or whether you have to use a light. So to see if it's flammable, I'm going to use my brûlée torch and just see what happens with one of these scrap pieces of foam. Okay, I have a scrap piece of foam on the end of a poker, and I have my brûlée torch. Let's see what happens. As you can see, fire is probably not the best option. If you wanted to use a regular candle, this would be a serious problem. So we're going to stick with battery-powered lights for the artificial pumpkins. So this is one of the many brands of battery-powered lights. This is from, I believe, no, it doesn't say. I believe the company was called Pumpkin Pros or Pro Pumpkins, something like that. It was available at my local supermarket. This one has a variety of modes. You can have a strobe light, a flickering yellow light, or a multicolor light. I'm just going to stick it in on the flickering yellow so it will imitate a candle and see what it looks like. There's the strobe. There's the flickering yellow. Put that inside. Not bad. That looks pretty good. When I dim the lights, it'll look even better. I'm happy with that. This next pattern is Sam from Trick or Treat. This is a pattern that I bought from Zombie Pumpkins. I'll link them down in the What's It in case you want to check it out for yourself. I chose this one next because this one has more fine details that I'm a little bit concerned about. It has some of what Slarty Bartfast would call fiddly bits. Yes, I know this is a horror channel. I don't care. I can make a sci-fi reference if I want to. So it's going to be a harder one to carve with all these little fiddly bits, but we're going to see how well that works even in the case of the artificial pumpkin. Now as I just finished up punching it through, I noticed there are some really small pieces that I'm not looking forward to having to carve, but that's what's going to make this a good test of the artificial pumpkin, because we're going to see how it handles that kind of difficult work. Fortunately, as you can see, it did transfer very well. Nevertheless, I'm going to retrace this with a pen to make it even more clear. Now if you retrace with a pen, you're going to have to get that ink off later. That is doable, so no harm done. What this is going to do is make it much easier for me to see exactly where those tiny little marks are. One thing I can say for the artificial pumpkin is it actually takes the ink a little bit better than the real pumpkins do. And that's what it looks like with the Sharpie mark around the pattern, which makes it just that little bit easier to see what it is that I'm going to be carving. Pattern's transferred, it's been traced with a Sharpie, let's get to carving. You know, some of these little tiny parts pose a challenge in deciding which tool to use. I'm going to try some knives, I'm going to try some saws, and we'll figure out what ends up working best. And it seems like actually a combination of the tools. That's one of the advantages of having a nice set of tools is you can always find some way to get the job done. And here also I see an advantage and a disadvantage to the artificial pumpkins. The advantage is the structural integrity holds up a little bit better around these delicate pieces, so you can get in there and work it without worrying about smashing your pumpkin to smithereens. And the disadvantage is the material itself is stringier than on a normal pumpkin, and it's harder to sort of scrape away and carve away. You have to really saw or cut this material away, which makes some of this delicate work more challenging in that regard. So while I'm carving, just a couple of comments about unrelated things. One thing you'll notice, I'm wearing a t-shirt. Now, usually I'm a button-down shirt kind of guy. I'm wearing this. This is the t-shirt that I got from the American Association for the Advancement of Science in support of vaccination. And since there seems to be emerging controversy about the vaccine research that's currently being done, it seemed appropriate that I should wear this shirt now. So that explains the t-shirt. Another thought that occurs to me is one of the possible disadvantages of the artificial pumpkin is there's no pumpkin pie. Now, that's not a big deal for me. I usually don't make pies out of my pumpkins. But I am sitting here in front of my spice rack, and I do have pumpkin pie spice there, so it just occurs to me that if you want pumpkin pie, this styrofoam isn't going to get the job done. I should also note that I have made this pattern small to fit on this tiny pumpkin. If you were going to do something this delicate, ordinarily I would recommend getting a bigger pumpkin, whether it's real or artificial. That would make a lot of these small pieces just that much easier to work with. And there's a finished Sam from Trick or Treat. This one did take about an hour and a half because of all the tiny little pieces. The artificial pumpkin does hold up against carving those little pieces, but it's not quite as easy to carve as a real pumpkin. I also noticed that this one in particular has variable thickness on the different sides, which made my work a little bit harder. This is also true commonly of real pumpkins. They're not always uniformly thick. I expected that these would have uniform thickness, but in fact they do not. This one will be the real test of these artificial pumpkins. This is a 3-color pattern. I have an enlarged version here. This is one of those where some of the pieces you leave, some you cut out, and some you shave down, so you can get 3 different shades of colors instead of just 2. This is a pattern called Bloody Mary, also from Stonykins. I've got it on the pumpkin. I'm getting ready to start transferring the pattern. The real trick here is going to be both that requires shaving this pumpkin, and I'm not sure how the artificial pumpkin is going to hold up to that task, but also there are lots of even smaller pieces on this one, so I expect this one's going to take me quite a while. I'm just going to come in and out on the video. You're not going to see the whole thing. So what I've done at this point, I transferred the pattern by poking through, and then I traced over it with a Sharpie to make sure that I can see exactly where everything's supposed to be, and I can tell which parts are supposed to be removed and which parts are supposed to be left alone and which parts are supposed to be just shaved. Now I'm moving through and actually shaving things down. What I notice with this artificial pumpkin is, though it carves just about as well as the real pumpkin, shaving through the paint and shaving through the foam to get the 3-color sort of a pumpkin is much harder. I don't like the artificial pumpkin as much for this purpose as I did for the others. It is possible, but it's much more labor intensive. The paint just sort of likes to, it's springier, and it likes to sort of go back to where it was rather than just shaving off like the rind of a pumpkin would. So this is going to take me a couple hours probably, but I'm going to finish it up and then I'll be back to show you what it looks like when it's finished. And that's a mostly finished product. As you can see, I've cut some out, I've shaved some. Now normally what you would do at this point is go back through and thin these shaved layers even more. As you can see though, with these tools that I'm using by hand, it just doesn't give very much. It doesn't scrape away very well. So I sort of have 2 options. I can either put a much brighter light inside than I have now, or I could take my Dremel and use power tools to shave it down even more. So I'm going to try another light first and see how that looks, and then I'll make up my mind. And that's what it looks like with actually a very powerful LED light inside. And I think that's good enough. Perhaps next year I actually will take the Dremel and
shave it down a little bit more so that a regular candle or a dimmer light would work just as well. But given the amount of stuff I still have to do before Halloween this year, I think I'm going with what I've got. And that's what I've come up with. I'm actually fairly impressed with these artificial pumpkins, as long as you're not doing the 3-color pumpkin carving. Even in that case, they do still work, but they're much harder to work with than the real pumpkins. I am, however, a traditionalist, so in addition to these, I will keep carving regular pumpkins every year. But if you're on the fence and you're looking for some alternatives, these are, in fact, a reasonable way you could go. Now that that's done, I have to get back to the rest of my Halloween preparations. You'll be seeing some of that on this channel. In the meantime, take care and stay scared.